This podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Patreon is a monthly subscription that you can cancel anytime, and PayPal is a one-time donation. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, the handle, the Beirut Banyan. And you can find us on our YouTube channel with the same name, and you can start watching the episodes as they're released. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan. Drew, thank you for staying up late to do this with me. I know that there's a healthy time difference between New York and Belfast. We're 5 hours apart. Anyone that's willing to stay up into the evening and lose an hour or two of sleep to deal with me, I consider a friend. So it's an honor for me that you're doing this. Also, during the middle of this pandemic, I think a lot of people are probably less prone to wasting time on a conversation online. They probably prefer doing other things. You're giving me your time, so that in itself, for me, it's worth something. Maybe you don't have better things to do. In that case, it's a win-win. The third thing I want to mention is that I guess we met a decade ago on the tour, on the Walk Beirut tour. And I don't know if we've seen each other since. Maybe we have, just in passing on the streets of Beirut. Maybe once or twice under the influence of a certain thing or two. Yeah, that's why I don't clearly remember those other times. I do remember, though, that you and also a common friend of ours, Eric Reedy, who was on the podcast recently, I got to meet from the tour. So in a way, I owe it to that tour to have met many voices that I've been speaking to on the podcast. So it's nice for me to now gauge your mind on a subject. Before getting into all that we're going to discuss, just want to ask your own sort of immediate life at the moment. What is it like being a
Pracademic?
Thank you. I'm going to actually insert this in the details box. What is it like to be a pracademic? And I'll let you explain what that means. In the middle of COVID-19, and are you able to focus and get the work done that you want to, or is this kind of interfering with your day-to-day life?
Well, first of all, it's a real honor to be on the show, and it's hard to think about a decade gone because there's significantly more gray hairs on my face, and I'm a lot more grizzled now. But I have to say, the tour was a great experience, and I used to recommend it to anyone who went to Beirut. I was like, look, if you want to get a snapshot of this wonderfully perplexing, complex, infuriating place, go on the tour, and then afterwards have a drink in Jemezi, where we probably saw each other passing.
That makes sense, yes.
At some point. As for me, at the moment, I'm finishing up my fellowship, Queen's University. It actually was scheduled to finish this month. So this global pandemic has come at a time where I was just entering into unemployment. And then rather than try to deal with the professional existential fear of that,
yes,
I just decided that no matter whatever happens on the other side of that, is for now, I'm going to open up my PhD and work on turning it into a workable transcript, or a workable manuscript, I should say. Transcript would be something else. So this is something that I have committed myself to, but yourself, and I'm sure that everyone else I've spoken to, when you think you would have more time, you actually have less time.
Absolutely, yes.
I mean, I have nephews and a niece that, we're helping educate, and there's all types of other, responsibilities you didn't think you had.
Yeah.
Suddenly, your discipline to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning has completely evaporated because, my office is only downstairs, so right. I'm not going to then just get up, shower, be super productive, get ready, and then go out.
At least you have a downstairs commute. Mine is just around this wall, so it's really.
I don't have any there's this truism: whenever we went back to school, it was like the person who was always late at school was the person who lived closest.
You're right.
So I'm consistently late to my own office, consistently late for my own hours, and then consistently don't hit the markers of books that I want to read, words that I want to write for this book. So yeah, the other part of that is then I'm just like, okay, I have really hit like a bit of a form in the last few weeks where I'm like, no matter what, I'm ending my day, I'm closing my computer, and I'm moving on, working out, or I'm going and I'm doing something else. I'm speaking with friends, I'm reading a book. Just like rather than just say, I have all the time in the world to get all this work done, and then suddenly the day just bleeds into one another and it's gone.
Right.
But yeah, I mean,
it's interesting. It's both. It's you have a lot of free time and you don't, and they kind of intersect. It's a strange feeling.
Schrodinger's professional timekeeping is that you simultaneously have no time and you simultaneously have all the time in the world.
You're right. Can you just remind me, though? I know we said this before we started recording. Pracademic, what does that mean?
Well, I'm not quite sure. So,
perfect.
In case my current bosses, at least for the next couple of weeks hear this, I am definitely an academic.
Okay.
Since I finished my PhD, or in actual fact, because we met when I was in the middle of my PhD, I had always a mind to take my academic endeavors into the real world, whether it's for NGOs, governments, different type advocacy groups. I really wanted to take the rigorous research skills and methodologies that I would learn in the academy, turn it into actionable research.
I see. So action is the key term, or that's the difference between staying in the library and actually getting out. Right.
Exactly. Meeting people like you, engaging in wider public dissemination. Because for me, I feel that one thing that academia has a lot of downsides. It also has a lot of positives. Working in the field has a lot of downsides. It also has a lot of positives. So basically what a pracademic tries to do is take that empirical rigor that you learn through your PhD, your engagement with conceptual engagement, learning how to create things epistemologically. Thank God I said the word live on the broadcast. And apply it into actual real world policy or practice that can help an NGO working with refugees, for example, which is my main subject area, or conflict resolution, or ethnic conflict management, which are my broad sort of academic disciplines. Right. So it's really about melding, bringing that knowledge and making it practically applicable to.
And I apologize for the cliche term, but I guess it's also skin in the game, that you're not just leaving your academic research to the library, that it's not just students in the library reading, that you're actually engaging your audience. And that, I think, I like that. I'm going to start using that term, even though I wouldn't consider myself an academic, but I'm just going to start using it left and right until it really catches on. I like this term.
Absolutely. Academic. A huge favor, because then we'd actually create a real myself in this era of unemployment. But there's also, you mentioned an important point, is that I adore teaching in academia. There's nothing like engaging with students, and I feel that students really value that practical experience. Whenever I was lecturing, convening courses on Middle East politics, I also had a previous postdoc at Durham, engaging students, giving lectures, and say, well, I was in Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan 2 weeks ago. People were like, oh, wow, really? It's like, and then let me tell you about the experiences and how this matches up with my practical applied research. I feel that students see a real value that they don't often get a lot of the times. And I don't blame academics or lecturers now, because we have a system that's based on publish or perish, constantly producing work.
Right.
They don't often get that time to practically engage or disseminate sometimes really impressive, well-researched, conceptually significant ideas to the real world. And unfortunately, that translation never happens. So essentially, if I had to distill it into a concept or an idea, my pracademic is that translation from the academy, from the library, into the real world, making sure it gets across.
You are the Indiana Jones of conflict resolution.
My hero, the guy who I've modeled my entire life on.
Right. I mean, apart from What's that?
The imperialistic stealing like key treasures from indigenous peoples across the world. Everything else.
Yeah, I hope you're not going back to Beirut to steal things and bring them to the UK. But I like that most of those movies would begin with Harrison Ford in front of the students, and then next second he's somewhere in the jungle. So yeah, you're the.
Well, I'll take that all day.
It's not bad.
I'll go get the whip, but I think that smuggling that into certain countries might not be allowed. But speaking of, I could easily just go into like dig up someone's back garden in the middle of Lebanon and find some Roman artifact that they've tossed aside.
There you go. Then it really that's when your career is not a Pracademic. You're just the Hollywood star at that point. You're like where the cameras appear and the microphones and the femme fatale with you as well. That's where the story really changes.
And there's a few of them in Lebanon as well. So
yeah. Exactly. No, but I like. So you're lecturing at Queen's University at the moment.
So my current position, it has no teaching, unfortunately. It's just been research where we're actually comparing to the states that we're talking about.
Yes.
But also Macedonia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So 4 power sharing states: Northern Ireland, Lebanon, Bosnia, and Macedonia. And we're looking at how those groups that are not considered in the initial power sharing arrangement gain inclusion, have their voices heard, or sometimes don't have their voices heard, as the case as we know in Lebanon.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned these countries up front, and I'll just sort of add this, that in, I think it was 2001, late 2001, I believe, I took a course at Queen's University on conflict resolution. Yeah. I spent I think 6 weeks. It was just one of these standalone courses. Not the fall or the spring semester. It was kind of like a winter course that they offered, conflict resolution. The name of the professor escapes me now. This is almost 2 decades ago. And he shared with us a lot of the Northern Ireland story that I knew nothing about. And this just came back to me that Lebanon, in those courses, was considered a role model on how to do power sharing. And I always found that to be quite entertaining. And this is a younger, sort of more naive, just a student trying to learn. But I thought that was quite funny. It's like, are we really the model? I don't know about that.
Us? Yeah.
And I didn't want to raise my hand and kind of interrupt somebody with that. It's not my place to do that. But I just remember thinking, like, the standards must be really low if that's the shining star.
Right, and I don't want to get too much into it, and certainly that humor speaks to a lot, because I've helped organize young politicians from Lebanon come to Northern Ireland, and had like some of the key architects of the Northern Irish power sharing agreement, the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement, specifically looked at Lebanon's constitution, at the National Pact, and said, how can we work this out? But I have to give a caveat, an apology at the start, because of my heritage of being both from Lebanon and from this island. I will say we in regards to both. Sure,
you have that. You can do that. Yeah.
It might be confusing for the audience, and if it's confusing for you, say which we are we talking about. But on that point, I often, I go to Lebanon and I say, you hear like quite a lot of cynical talk about the power sharing agreement and how it works, and I'm writing a book on the critiques of it, so I have many of my own. But the fact is I say, okay, let's take a snapshot and look at the regional environment that you're in, the neighbors that you've had, their pathologies, their influence in the country, before that a Mandate territory, before that Ottoman territory, before that an Ottoman territory which had successive migrations of different groups coming to it. All things considered, Lebanon staying stable is a political miracle.
That's well said. Given the context, it has stood on its own 2 feet as long as it could. That's right. Well said. Yes.
I mean, of course, and I'm not like disregarding any of this incredibly problematic things that happen with the Zaim or with the economy currently, and the capture of that economy, or any of that stuff. However, you compare, I was like, in Northern Ireland, we need mediation from the US. We needed the 2 kin states that that border and are the state itself in the UK and Ireland, creating its own separate agreement. And it's still, the conflict's still not solved, because the central question of whether Northern Ireland should remain a part of the UK or secede and become a unitary part of Ireland is still going on. And in those days, in the days of the Troubles, that started in 1969, ended with the Good Friday Belfast Agreement in 1998, and if you look at the academic literature on power sharing, many of the key scholars said, we really find it very difficult to imagine this is a conflict that can be solved. And while the Northern Ireland conflict has become kind of the exemplar ahead of Lebanon now, there's an industry here where there's a lot of the former politicians that go out to different countries and say, you know what you need power sharing. Let me tell you how to do it.
Are they recruiting you for that?
I have engaged in a little bit linked to one of the stories that I'll tell you about decommissioning in a bit. But Northern Ireland became the exemplar. But yet, only recently, our government our devolved local government was restarted after over 1,000 days of holdout. Over 1,000. We now hold the record. There's me switching to we in Northern Ireland. Hold for longest term without government. So, despite the fact that there is largely good mediation, very positive and constructive mediation from our neighbors and international actors, which Lebanon doesn't get, we still held out for over 1,000 days. So that just shows you just the depth of division.
Sure. Yes.
Problems, and the fact that we haven't. I can swear on this podcast, right?
Yeah, and if you want, actually, if you want to swear in different dialects and different languages, please do. I mean, as much as you'd like.
That's fantastic that we haven't got our own shit worked out.
But I like that you're saying this up front, and that's actually it's good to remember that even the cases that are looked at as sort of potentially quote unquote solved conflicts, and they're not necessarily solved, that they have their own issues and they're persistent. And I think I like the way you're saying this, that Lebanon is not. It's not fair just to throw Lebanon as a basket case and say, it's gone to hell and that's it. That there is some positive angles that should be emphasized, and I like that you're saying that. Given the context, Lebanon is doing okay, and maybe that word can be sort of, we can argue exactly what okay means, especially in what is happening now the last few months. That's a perfect introduction. And just before I want to argue, not argue. I don't know. It's not fair to argue against you two at this moment. But what I remember is walking around Belfast, and we had a tour guide showing us things that for me were insane. These quote peace walls, and I never imagined that in the UK. Sorry, not in Northern Ireland. I'll correct that. In Northern Ireland, you would have that kind of physical barrier separating communities. Lebanon, you can't even imagine that. There are different types of divisions in Lebanon. Some of them are more security, and some of them are more, sub-state behavior-like, but that's not a wall. That's not a barrier between communities, and I thought that was profound. And of course, going back to you too, that you could determine which side of the conflict you were on by which type of music you're playing from your pub. And I would just, I'm like, this is still when U2 was digestible. But when you leave Belfast after a month, you're like, I never want to hear this band play. I just want to run away from this entire scene. So much emphasis on minute details. And Bono's voice is one of those kinds of divisions. I thought that was insane. And then, of course, the artistic expression is what I assumed was the closest. That you see these beautiful murals, beautiful graffiti. It's real art. And you're seeing that today in Beirut as well. Shades of that and this kind of artistic expression. And that always got me thinking that, these conflicts, there are common threads, and then there are fundamental differences. And I like that you've hinted at that, and I think you said it well.
There is if you want to explore more, there is a friend of mine, Omar Masri, who just got his PhD, who does that art comparison and that expression comparison between those two cities. He's been doing his PhD here in Belfast.
Oh, excellent.
And he's Beirut full. But you mentioned the point, which is everyone has this real visceral reaction when they see the walls.
Yes.
And again, speaking back to bringing Lebanese politicians over, young Lebanese politicians and those engaged, they're like, this is just unbelievable. And 80% of those walls were constructed after our peace agreement.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
The people. I was like, look, you can't pull the wool over my eyes. The walls exist, as you exactly said. Are you telling me there's not a giant dividing line right down the middle of Beirut, which we called the Green Line back in the day, that now doesn't actually, separate communities and separate ideas? The walls are mental, but in divided societies, these walls exist. It creates cantons of different communities, and they absolutely exist. And sort of my defense of Northern Ireland will say, hold on a second, those walls exist. We all know those conversations, whether it's like someone in Juni or it's someone in Saida, where they always talk like, oh, don't go to that side of town, or don't make travel up the road there because it's the person from the other community.
Right.
And Northern Ireland, we say themins or thosins. And there's one particular anecdote that we say in Northern Ireland, this often repeated joke. And because pretty much if you live in this, or you've spent time in this community, at one point this will have happened to you, where someone gets stopped in the middle of the street, and I'll make it Lebanese. I'll actually give you an example of my own experience, which was being stopped in the middle of the road on the way walking home from high school, and I said, "Are you a Catholic or a Protestant?" So, which is a very dicey question depending on.
Shia.
I said Greek Orthodox.
Rome.
Which is true, okay, it wasn't a lie, so I could sell it convincingly. And they had a huddle and they said, okay, well, are you a Catholic Greek Orthodox or a Protestant Greek Orthodox? And this is an often repeated joke. I happen to say, well, they fell out with the Catholic Church, but they believe in Mother Mary.
Yes.
So your pick. But yeah, these divisions, we find them everywhere. They're a creation of the parallel society in which, everything from speech, how you speak, obviously, language is a huge one. The Irish Language Act, which is one of the reasons why we didn't have a government. Well, the debates over why we didn't have a government for over 1,000 days. To those minute social interactions.
Sure, and even it's I guess when you go there, it becomes cliche, but still, to me, it's important. The difference between saying Derry or Londonderry can mark you, and that there's no sort of debate over how to say Trablus, wala Junie, wala Saida, wala Sur. So, and I like that you're able to offer nuance on both sides, on the Northern Ireland example and Lebanon. And based on your research, the Dayton Accords in the Balkans, Bosnia, and Macedonia. So for the sake of this episode, I'm going to try to narrow it down just to the Northern Ireland Lebanese story. Although all of the above are important, and actually even, ETA in northern Spain is important too, and there are many different FARC in Colombia, but we'll sort of limit it to what's maybe most familiar. Otherwise, we'll get our own podcast series and just call it Conflict Resolution Forever. So let's maybe just a sort of a basic understanding of the geopolitical considerations that make these two examples both potentially similar and different. And let's start with Northern Ireland and just maybe the curiosity of external parties trying to get involved in an otherwise domestic dispute, and whether or not there was real sort of appetite for that kind of engagement. And what I mean by that is, as far as I know from my limited knowledge on the Northern Ireland story and the IRA, that the parties that got involved really just were limited. That this was primarily a UK-Ireland story, that you don't have French curiosity, you don't have other countries trying to interfere. There's no Netherlands sort of feeling how the dispute is emerging, or for that matter, American curiosity. Even though it was there, it was limited as well. And then, of course, let's start there, and then we can go to the Lebanese context.
So, I'll speak back about 5 minutes ago when I mentioned about the Lebanese consideration of how badly we're doing, the regional environment. Lebanon is a strategic hub. You're in an area which has oil, in a region that has oil, that has major powers, has successive big powers involvement. That, and we can talk about the larger or the great powers involvement in Lebanon through sponsoring specific clients on the ground, which of course helped precipitate the initial first ethnic conflicts in Lebanon in the 1800s, 1840s and 1860s. In Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland is a strategic backwater in comparison.
Right.
To our regional neighbours is the Atlantic. and the Irish Sea and the differences. And we have a kin border whenever the creation of the border, 1921, between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Of course, that we saw initial successive attempts by the IRA to not give up the fight. What precipitated, a very large civil war precipitated in Ireland over whether to acquiesce to the terms of the agreement and separating the country and Southern Ireland being created, or the Republic of Ireland being created. So there was this constant tension and feeling within the south of Ireland that there was still a part of the country that was not yet reunited. Right. And I actually wouldn't undermine, I'm not saying you did, but you pointed out a fact that was very important to the precipitation of the end of the conflict, which was American involvement. A huge amount of American involvement in Northern Irish conflict in terms of sponsoring, in terms of money being sent to sponsor groups in Northern Ireland. This was an important factor, and also helped Clinton's involvement in the conflict. Right. Wasn't something that he initially, having spoken to people who were part of that administration, that he was that overly sold on in terms of committing to a peace agreement in Northern Ireland. Right. But we saw and reminded in 1994 one of the most important sort of political moves that helped lead to the end of the Northern Irish conflict was the U.S. granting a visa to Gerry Adams, leader of Sinn Féin. This was hugely rejected in the UK by the UK government because at one point, members of Sinn Féin, there was a broadcast ban where they weren't allowed to have their voices on BBC television. Right. It was considered an illegal paramilitary or terrorist group, and sponsored a terrorist group, and political support the political voice of a terrorist group. So they literally stripped their own voices, and it was this common. Like growing up, you would watch the news, and if there was a member of Sinn Féin, they'd be blacked out, and someone dubbed them over and say their words. So the U.S. giving essentially political cover or normalizing the IRA and Sinn Féin, a Republican political position, was very, very important, sort of effectively meddling, or what we start off by saying meddling. So there was definitely an international involvement. Moreover, we also started mentioning off FARC and ETA. So the IRA was always very keen to internationalize its struggle. Right. So Gerry Adams was a honored guest at Nelson Mandela's funeral, and sorry to interrupt, I just recalled this, that Palestinian flags all over the place in Northern Ireland, and graffiti, like, painted flags, not the actual flag, but murals of the flag. It was crazy. Right. Yeah. Right. And we have this area in a very Republican nationalist Catholic area, the International Wall still there, which still calls today the international struggles of the Kurds in Turkey, and of Palestine, and of South Africa, and of the civil rights movement. And because whenever the Troubles started in 1969, it started not initially with violence, but it started off with a labor movement and a civil rights movement here as well, by a man who would go on to win a Nobel Peace Prize for helping bring Northern Ireland to peace, John Hume. And in that, there was a great correlation and parallel drawn to international conflicts, and this was an important part of the strategy of bringing to attention what was going on here in Northern Ireland for that community. Right. And whether we can agree or disagree, that internationalization, being associated with international freedom fighters and people who struggle against apartheid, helps create a legitimacy for your cause, which was certainly one of the most important aspects of the IRA campaign. That's interesting. So that's a nice segue into the Lebanese context, because I like that you said it's a strategic backwater for, in other words, that it literally is. I mean, it's a remote part of the island, and it's hard to interfere in that sense. And I like that you corrected the American sort of story. And absolutely, I mean, the Good Friday Agreement and all that, there is an American sort of component to that story. And even in terms of the Kennedys used to sort of not openly endorse the IRA, that never happened, but there was sort of maybe a different approach, let's say, than Sorry, just a quick point. This has always been an irony within the Irish American population are very fiercely conservative in terms of their outlook, but supported the IRA, which was as a very socialist outlook on its politics generally.
Right.
So there, financial support coming from this led by Catholic conservatism and social conservatism towards this economic and socially liberal organization in the north, because it was an ethnic kinship and it was a national calling. So it's always an impressive irony for me to draw these parallels as well.
Absolutely. But then you have that sort of dynamic in Northern Ireland. Throw it to Lebanon, a sub-state group that has, to a large degree, now determines the security parameters of the way the Lebanese state behaves, has a sort of overwhelming influence on the foreign policy matters of Lebanon. You correct me if I'm wrong here, that and you said it at the beginning that it's a sort of a center of strategic concern for all the players you mentioned earlier, and particularly the Lebanese case is always modern Lebanon is associated with geopolitical quagmire, so you can't really detach the two. But then you have a group that does not sort of have that international component. If Hezbollah has friends, it doesn't really go. It goes places, but it doesn't go the way you'd have the IRA kind of doing deliberate sort of strategizing in that sense, that you don't find people really rallying around the Hezbollah cause. That kind of doesn't, there's a disconnect there. And the regional, America sort of maybe pushes for getting the Good Friday Agreement signed, and America's involved. You don't have that kind of determination to demilitarize or find a way to disarm peacefully Hezbollah. That's kind of off the table completely. Did I get that right?
I think you're 100% right, and you hit on a number of really important distinctions. And this initially started by you asking me to compare and contrast the two. And I wanted to point that internationalized normalization of the IRA struggle more broadly is definitely a contrast with Hezbollah. Not only that, whenever you look at the agreements, Hezbollah's arms as the resistance is made permissible in the Taef. So whereas in Northern Ireland's peace process, the decommissioning of arms was an integral part of the entire process.
Right.
The lack of decommissioning on the initial time, according to the initial timeline of the agreement, was the reason why the government was first brought down in the first place. Why we had a suspension of our local devolved government. It ended the career of those initial unionist Protestant loyalist politicians that wanted to sign up to the agreement in the first place.
Right.
So no matter what, our peace process was intrinsically linked with the process of getting rid of arms. Whereas in Lebanon's case, we had an entire south of the country that was occupied currently by the neighbor state, which was considered, off limits and an enemy to everyone who signed the Taef Agreement, and that those actors who were operating against them were legitimized. And that continuation, and also this is another really important contrast point, is that 2000 and Israel retreats. That even if Israel retreats, we still live, again, this is me going to my Lebanese in an area and a region that has regional rivalries playing out their positions, most notably, obviously, in Yemen and Syria in the last decade. Lebanon was the quintessential example before that. So Hezbollah then can then reimagine its arms not only as a resistance against Israel, who helps fuel that particular rhetoric by its aggression against Palestinians inside of Israeli-Palestine borders. So there is always a reason to be able to justify keeping hold of those weapons. And that interlinking or decoupling of the conflict with weapons was never a part of the Lebanese peace agreement.
I'm going to try to unpack this as much as possible, because I like that this is an important turning point in the Lebanese story. and 2000, May of 2000, the Israelis withdraw to the UN blue line for the most part, and these minor disputes that remain are disputes that don't necessarily lend credence to keeping a sub-state group weaponized to the degree that Hezbollah is weaponized. And I remember that was the raison d'etre of keeping Hezbollah's arms for at least until 2008, until the events of 2008, then where Hezbollah turned its arms inwards. But let's start with 2000, and I'm going to try to keep this sort of as I'm going to try to portray the picture objectively, and you tell me if I'm getting anything wrong, because I'd like your feedback here. That you have the Good Friday Agreement signed 2 years earlier, 1998, if I'm not mistaken, 1998, and you have, and I like that you pointed this out, an inherent determination to disarm all sub-state groups, period. That includes the IRA and whatever, that all are kind of on the table. The only kind of comparison in the Lebanese context, if one exists, is 1559, UN Security Council Resolution 1559. And then you have 1701, which follows the July 2006 war. And then you have that attempt, the Ba'abda Declaration in Lebanon, in Ba'abda when Mikhael is president. That's not really to disarm anyone, that's just trying to keep Hezbollah out of the Syrian war. So these are flirtations with a genuine attempt at disarming the last remaining militia following Lebanon's civil war.
Right. It's this Lebanese attempt at to decouple outside regional influence in. It's like maybe we should stop trading on our patrons and their ups and downs in their regional conflict because it has a really bad impact on us. Yeah, and you made a point, really, really, really important point there, which is the fact that which international actors and their declarations in terms of decommissioning weapons in Lebanon, there isn't, and then again, this is a contrast with the IRA, is that there's neutral mediators involved in the decommissioning. There is no way that if it came down to the UK saying, right, this is the Good Friday Agreement, and we're going to be the arbiters of decommissioning the IRA weapons, they would not have handed over their weapons to the UK, because this is still considered the occupying state. I mean, it wasn't until 2007 that all British Army forces or operational army forces had left Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. So there's no way they would have said, "Yep, we're decommissioning. That's fine. We'll hand it over to the state that we've been fighting." 800 plus years since their first implantation on this island. Not going to happen. What had to happen was that there had to be an international mediation and oversight through the decommissioning committee that had to ensure that it was a neutral arbiter that could hand over. What such actor exists in the Lebanese case? Right, exactly. It seems empty. There's nothing there. Yeah. Effectively, I was thinking about this whenever doing my daily pandemic exercise. I was like, what I can draw a parallel to is that if Iran stepped in and asked Hezbollah to disarm, it would have to be a neutral ethnic kin, or sectarian kin, or confessional kin, that would have to say, it is time for you to disarm. Sorry to interrupt. Would that be? I know that the relationship is fundamentally different. But would that be like Dublin asking the IRA to sort of, that's it, it's over? Does it line up that way? And effectively, in 1985, one of the earlier steps to peace was the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which was when the UK and Irish governments got onto the same page about how they would approach the security in Northern Ireland. That they would try to absolutely limit any kind of involvement in either government on either side, and try to break and limit the security outbreak there. So that was a step, and you're right to call that. So you would have to see a joint Syrian Iranian document that sort of looked at that told Hezbollah that it's time actually to really fully commit to the Lebanese political process without arms. Well, in that window, the lead up to the Good Friday Agreement, and then the signing and all the reasons that it happened.
Can you imagine that scenario lining up in the Lebanese context, given the fundamental different geopolitical factors? And that Lebanon is such a, I mean, the layers are so entrenched, and it's so hard to imagine all of them kind of agreeing that we should just neutralize Lebanon and leave it alone. I don't know if there's any, I don't want to sound too romantic in that sense, but that seems to be the only way out in terms of turning Lebanon into a sovereign state.
Right. I would agree. I would also agree with your assessment that it seems particularly difficult, but considering that the path dependency of Lebanon's governance has sailed on the whims of its patrons. So as the internet or the regional geopolitical stock exchange moves in favor of Iran, what do we see? The empowerment of Iranian, or like what we say, actors on the ground in Lebanon being empowered in the scene. I mean, this is international relations and ethnic politics and civil conflicts 101. Is not a great surprise to say that. How do we decouple that is the question. Obviously, the Babda Declaration was an attempt to do so, but but in the immediate aftermath, the fact is that we went through a very long and bloody civil war.
We is the Northern Ireland or Lebanon here?
So it was essentially both.
Both, right.
We're still dealing with a lack of reconciliation from the conflict.
Yes.
And in Lebanon, we know that we're, no victor, no vanquished. Okay, we're still dealing with this issue, the issues remnant from the Civil War. There hasn't been like a commitment to transitional justice elements that have like tried to draw communities together. And I think that is something that Thawra really brought attention to. It was a genuine like, oh wow, we're all on the same page. All of our Zayim are shit. And we really have got to move on from it. I think that we haven't had that kind of like universal like coalescence or congruence of the different ethnic elites or the different ethnic groups, because 150,000 people killed because of population transfers, because of displacement. These are transgenerational traumas that take a long time, even under the best of circumstances, to get over. And Northern Ireland's a case study because we're not over it. We still have those wounds. We have 1.5 billion euros worth of peace money to try and create reconciliation between the only two communities, not 18, in Northern Ireland, and we're still nowhere close to it. And in Lebanon, we haven't had anywhere near that commitment to reconciliation. So why should they reconcile when we haven't reconciled emotionally and politically? Why should they decouple from those actors who might give them the leg up in the balance of power on the ground?
And that's actually a very important factor, that in Lebanon you have communities that are trying desperately, and they pushed very hard, at least 7 months in October, to reunite in a way that kind of takes everyone down, including the last militia to remain following the civil war, and sort of putting them and saying you're not exempt, you're part of the problem. And that's a very important factor. And then in Northern Ireland, there's no Sauda per se. There's no revolution. You have the Good Friday Agreement, and then, like you said, then the walls go up. It's almost like, okay, we'll live together, but we just don't need to really live together. And it's almost like a separation going back to marriage versus divorce. And it seems like divorce seems to be the functioning way at the moment in Northern Ireland. But of course, divorce with very, very clear terms, that it's almost, we know exactly who gets what at the end of the day. In Lebanon, there's no talk of that. And there's no you can't really separate. So you're kind of forcing a marriage that hopefully will work one day.
I love this analogy, and let me try and like work with it with you on it.
Sure, but Drew, I'm going to ask you just one thing. Do you have a light in your room that you could turn on? Because you faded to black at some point. No, I was like, this is amazing. Just sort of the shadow. No, you look great. Thanks.
Didn't want to disappear into the dark. Yeah. In speaking, so correct me and then we can work with this analogy a little bit more, is that speaking about Northern Ireland in terms of the divorce, and you mentioned we worked out the terms. The terms were placed in Taef, right? Good Friday Agreement.
Yes. The Good Taef Accord.
Yeah, exactly. It's all mixing. The terms were set, but as I mentioned earlier, we've had government suspensions because the divorce paper was set, but we're still working out who gets the cat, or who has the who gets the house, or how do we separate the inheritance, or what do we do with the kids. Very, very serious issues were left on the table that are still and haven't been worked out. Irish language acts or language acts, a Bill of Rights, also really important.
Yes.
The disappeared, so this is where I draw a lot of similarities between Lebanon. There's an issue over families who are looking for people who are disappeared during the Troubles. Right. So we still, there's that divorce process that's still working out within Northern Ireland. And then looking at Lebanon, and this is, I'm going to quote Ayman Mahanna, which is in my PhD, which he said, the conflict, the pause button was hit.
That's Taef. That's 1989. That's, yes, yeah.
How is Taef, we had elected politicians from 1972 go to a foreign state, mediated by foreign actors, which is all fine, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with the fact that, these things happen, because this is often the way of very complex civil wars and how they are solved. But you had actors whose relevance had been completely undermined by a new generation of Lebanese political elite. Right? They weren't, those 1972 parliamentarians weren't the actors on the ground representing the community. So that's why we saw the Taef Agreement being agreed, but did we see the immediate end of the Lebanese civil war? No, because the actors on the ground and the balance of power favored the newer actors who were in control of the community.
In that sense, go ahead.
Jumped in, or the Gulf War started, and then Syria was given the blessing to confirm its hegemony in Lebanon that we saw after the war. Hence, the button was pushed.
But does that come to just in terms of intention, that London wanted to see an end to the Northern Ireland issue, Dublin wanted to see an end to this issue, and America seemed to be engaged, perhaps reluctantly at the beginning, but eventually sort of found a way in and participated heavily. In the Lebanese story, 1989, Taef is signed with the the intention of the Syrian army leaving within a few years. Of course, it doesn't until 15 years later. And in Taef, and I think, it's pretty much said that Hezbollah is the exception, that every other militia or sub-state group or whatever, any other group that was involved in the civil war needs to disarm and will be disarmed. Of course, the caveat is that the last group that does not get disarmed seems to be toe in toe with the Syrian regime, and in other words, it's just the intentions of sorry.
The balance of power of the strongest on the ground actors. Right.
That in other words, the Lebanese civil war ends not the way the Northern Ireland Troubles era ends. That the Lebanese civil war, as you hinted at earlier, this is just we're going to patch things up without finding any solution per se. The caveat is that one group survives militarily, and that's really the core issue. That's what.
Several things I want to unpack here that are really important. That is the balance of power on the ground, the logistic impact. The IRA had become deeply penetrated by the British intelligence services and their ability to carry out a campaign. Because Gerry Adams and other key Republican figures early on in the Troubles had claimed that they were, it's do or die, it's United Ireland or else, and we are settling in for a long war. Their ability to carry out that campaign was significantly reduced. In addition to the fact that the IRA's initial surge in popularity came after Bloody Sunday in 1972. I don't know if you're familiar. You two have a song about it.
That's for better or worse. That's how I first heard of it. Yes.
Yeah. So it was a very formative event in Northern Ireland's Trouble, which actually people turned around and said, no, violence is a way, because look at what's happened. Right. The later commissions have said, these were 13 people innocently gunned down. This was a disgrace, and everyone felt it. So there was a surge in their popularity, and we saw the largest part of the Northern Irish in terms of deaths in that early period up until 1976. And then what you saw was a winding down, or a tit-for-tat sectarian killing, which then became massively distasteful in Northern Ireland's local milieu. So there was a war fatigue that was setting in. So it was definitely, you mentioned about the international mediation. I mentioned the 1985 Anglo-Irish agreement, US starting to penetrate into Northern Ireland, the logistics of the IRA unable to carry out the campaign to the same level,
right.
And also the significant efforts on the ground by different conflict resolution people and peace movement people in Northern Ireland contributed to a much more natural ending of the civil war in comparison to, I don't have a point to pick out of your characterization of Lebanon's ending of its civil war, that you had a hegemonic actor that saw a sub-state group as very useful, and as soon as Syria and Hezbollah worked out their problems at the end of the Lebanese civil war, it became a very symbiotic relationship.
And I remember this from my own experience. I was a teenager living at the Lebanese embassy in Washington. My father at the time was the ambassador, and this is when the Israelis pulled out in May of 2000. And I recall this: the most angered entity in that whole issue is the Syrian regime. That they were really upset that the Israelis were leaving, and that I think it just shows right that's it. That there's a country that is determined to keep Lebanon as a battlefield. And therefore, you need to have a group with weapons that can do that. And that there's nothing like that in the Northern Ireland story. There's no determined actor to keep the IRA active, at least in the military context.
Or the other paramilitary groups.
Yeah, exactly, right.
And I have to say that, despite all that, it's almost like, okay, there's a sunshine and rainbows. What has happened, and just to highlight how Northern Ireland hasn't got its shit sorted out. If there was a united Ireland tomorrow, maybe, for example, an economic disaster hits, which unfortunately we're probably globally going to hit, that befalls Northern Ireland in the wake of Brexit, and it suddenly becomes much more an attractive proposition to reunite with Ireland, who remains a part of the EU.
Mm-hmm.
You will still, even in that event, you will still be left with a significant proportion of the population in the north of Ireland, of the then Ireland, who absolutely fundamentally cannot ever agree that they should belong, they remain British.
Right.
So then effectively you're replicating the same consequence or the same cauldron and ingredients that led to the conflict in the first place. So we're always carefully trying to manage, and this is why we see those divisions, these walls and those divisions, those cultural, social divisions that you noticed,
mm-hmm.
Why these are constantly replicated, because you'd have two dichotomous ethno-national identities that have to live in parallel. There is a third way that we can try and promote, that actually you're not Irish, you're Northern Irish, which means you're both British and Irish together, but it's a growing movement, and that could be our version of Thaura.
Right. That makes sense. I'm just going to go back to one thing. You reminded me, and I should actually sit down and think this through. When I was in Belfast, on the conflict resolution course, there was a car bombing in Belfast, in front of a hotel, and that's all I remember. Mm-hmm. And the reason it's not a vivid memory is because the locals treated it the way Lebanese treat it. Exactly. It's like, oh no, it's just it's down the street. Don't worry. It's almost like that's a different neighborhood. And I really
just read beside it, and you'll be fine.
You just don't make a left, don't go right. And I just, I was like, oh, this is familiar. Yes. So that to me was the stark sort of that's the example of common understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there's so many of them, and just on a quick point is that you mentioned about like the saddest people in the room being the Syrians about the Israelis leaving.
Yes.
That if you look at like Hezbollah and you compare its pathology with the IRA, or its progenitor in the early 80s after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, right? Attacking the US first, or attacking the Marine base, right?
Yes.
Assassination of Malcolm Kerr, or any of these other instances, right? It's fundamentally always been in part of its rhetoric anti-imperial, and that doesn't need to be a specific actor. It doesn't need to be specifically Israel. A resistance can, in their mind and their rhetoric, can continue on against anyone, can continue on against like someone who is going to impinge on the sovereignty of Lebanon, and we are the vanguards against that, regardless of whether it's Israel in South Lebanon, or it is Saudi, or it's people who want to like the Free Syrian Army or someone else. You can always repackage this rhetoric.
That's actually Yeah, let's get into the lexicon, and I like that you pointed at the if you will, the evolution of the IRA, and that's not necessarily good for the IRA. That it kind of, as you said, gets penetrated by British intelligence. It becomes an unpopular method of reunification with Ireland, and it becomes, in a way, very difficult for them to act using weapons, right? And that I just want to ask one quick question: are they not in? Forget the UK. Let's say the rest of Ireland. Are they considered terrorists by the locals? Is that word used in Dublin as this is a terrorist group?
Unfortunately, Dublin's a worlds apart from Northern Ireland. It's really different. It would be very difficult for me to say what the common sort of understanding of the street is about that specific question. But you certainly would have like in and there's a joke in the north that it's like people in the south, they have actually no care about what happened, very little care in the deep south. Now, if you're on the border, if you're in the border territories, you are deeply affected. Like where you named Dublin, which is very south, south. Yeah, not most south, but definitely south enough. It was like the idea of Northern Ireland be like, oh, this is those people kicking off again. Can they just like give over so this is why in the Good Friday Agreement, reunification with Ireland has to happen in a double lock system, where there has to be a referendum of the majority in the north and in the south that accepts it.
Right.
So we have these explicit arrangements in our peace agreement to try and like work out the social mood towards reunification of the north, or whether or not that's even a viable structure, because there's a very big economic question about whether or not they would want us, because we might be an economic drain, probable economic drain, and the UK has long since had a feeling of like the Northern Ireland headache. It's been issue that they have wanted finished, or not to constantly have to come in and mediate and deal with and subsidize. So I mean, I think that's those are very interesting and important sort of intersections that overlap. But I will say that just as an important point is that the national, or the like cohorts, or Republican national community. So if you look at other parties like the SDLP in the north, which was ostensibly its goal is to reunify with the South. Absolutely abhorred the idea of violence, and decommissioning was just as important to them as it was to other groups.
But I'm just curious, I mean, because for me, and I say this as somebody not involved whatsoever in that issue, I do associate the terms IRA and terrorism, and this is somebody having just watched the news. It's not a nuanced explanation. It's just those two words seem to link up whenever you read about that story, even if. And that can be debated, but that's sort of the terminology is used frequently.
Right.
But is that in your opinion, is that something that's shared among reunification supporters, that they looked at the IRA as, yes, a terrorist group, and that is terrorism?
Absolutely. You'll like look at within like members of the Catholic community who absolutely abhorred like the methods of the IRA and would have called it 100%.
Okay.
100%. Yes. We don't want to ever treat like the Shia.
No. Yeah, sure.
Because there is a diverse variety of opinion, but like for sure there is there has and continues to be, even historically now, such antipathy towards like the methodology that the IRA used within even amongst like their cohorts who want to reunify with the Republic of Ireland. Yes, that exists 100%. The reason
I'm curious about this is that the term in Lebanon, and you mentioned it earlier, resistance, that word has an evolving meaning that has two things happen. It expands, and it also sort of gets sort of narrower over time. And that many people that thought of Hezbollah as a, quote, resistance group maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, look at them now as a terrorist group. And I think even the term militia is kind of lobbed into that as well. But the term resistance gets sort of more, it's almost like there's a pass given to Hezbollah, that their weapons seem to be not the same as other sub-state groups fighting different causes. That the FARC, ETA, IRA, or any group, and the Balkans is another example. The Bosnian Serb paramilitary, what's his name, Krajic and Mladic, and these characters. I mean, Hezbollah, that word gives them a pass beyond Taef, that it's a word that's embraced among large swaths of not just Lebanese, but, Syrians and Iraqis, maybe even Iran. It gets complicated too. But is the lexicon part of the story? That Hezbollah, okay. Can you maybe just get into that a bit, and why is that? Why does that kind of perhaps prevent a willingness to disarm that group?
So to add more flavor to the characterization you had there, was that if you had polled the Lebanese after May 2008, what would be in the favor towards Hezbollah's arms at that point?
Right. Exactly.
It would have been.
Yeah.
Poll it in 2015, whenever you had the emergence of Daesh, and then Hezbollah's sort of rhetoric was to say that we're actually a vanguard against these animals and these devils who are like in a neighboring state and could come over here. I've heard many of different confessional backgrounds people express an admiration for Hezbollah's military engagement in Syria in 2015, who were saying the complete opposite whenever they started, when it was the big secret when they started in 2011.
Right.
I mean, we see that importance, and that is why I mentioned at the start about a legitimization of your cause. For example, another important point is that I mentioned again the blackout or the voice blackout of Sinn Féin members.
Yes.
The Troubles. As soon as it became public that the British were negotiating with the IRA and with Sinn Féin for decommissioning, they stopped being called a terrorist organization on BBC and started being a paramilitary organization. So there's also a battle now. I don't want to get into too postmodern and say that I
don't have my Derrida manual with me, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Pracademia à la Foucault.
Yeah, I was about to say. But they do have an important political impact, is that the fact that Thatcher and the Conservative government at the time, said we don't negotiate with terrorists. That's why it led to quite a large PR disaster with the hunger strikes, and that only gave them further legitimacy. So then it became politically expedient to then start negotiation, and you can't then go back on your word and say, oh, we're negotiating with terrorists. Well, no, we're negotiating with a paramilitary group that has obtained international legitimization in the eyes of many. Now, of course, the methodology and use of violence and use of force is being widely debated, but we can start to say that those persons holding in a political opinion of Northern Ireland should unite with the Republic have a legitimate grievance that is rooted historically. So there was that connection to a tangible, real political outcome. Whereas, as I said, the point I made about if you poll Lebanon's or Lebanese or different Lebanese response to the resistance, it's going to see, in my opinion, it's going to see a great deal of variance depending on what those weapons have just been used for. Have they been used in downtown Beirut against other Lebanese? Have they been being used in Syria against people fighting against the regime? And that's going to matter greatly.
So in that sense, the IRA, the lexicon wasn't so controversial. It was controversial to a point, but it was managed. In Lebanon, it's something that's not really digestible, that this word is too loose in a sense, that you can never get to the issue that this is an armed militia, or that you can't say it that way.
Yeah. Who are you resisting against? Right. Name factors. Why are you resisting against? So why do you require drones? Why do you require proliferation of arms? What is the resistance for? And that's why, if we're looking at it from political discourse or rhetoric, it's genius. You can replicate your cause over and over again.
And it's something I think, it's mentioned, but it should be mentioned more, that even that term predates Hezbollah. So it's almost like they co-opted the term to make them an exclusive militia. We have older, quote, resistance groups fighting in Lebanon, in Lebanese history. These are, tend to be left-wing sort of paramilitary groups at the beginning of the civil war. But Hezbollah becomes the monopoly that that the term is theirs to use as they see fit.
They've TM'd resistance, so they
you're right. But is there, in your experience, and maybe we can wrap it up with just getting out of Northern Ireland and Lebanon, is there any example where the situation like we see today in Lebanon works, where you have a sub-state group with that much leverage, that much authority, able to spare regimes from falling next door, able to fight on the side of other paramilitary groups in Iraq, able to, in a way, survive beyond the Taef Accord, beyond 2006, beyond 2008, beyond Ba'abda, where in 2020, mass uprising, they're part of the story, and they're still there. They're still intact. Is there any example where this kind of dance works? Because in my mind, I'm just going to go back to what you said at the beginning. Yeah, it is a miracle that Lebanon survived. It is a miracle. Yeah.
Well, I think that we also can't we've talked a lot about the weapons side of Hezbollah, but obviously the growth of it as a political organization, and this is where there's a tremendous parallel with the IRA and Sinn Féin.
Right.
As an effective political organization, incredibly effective, incredible mobilization, incredible party discipline, incredible sort of levels of organization across the board, and especially in comparison to its cohorts within the Lebanese scene, they are by far and away the most effective political actor, for better or worse. And we can say that undoubtedly the iceberg presence of arms underneath it is a contributing factor. Of course it is. Yeah. No one's going to say otherwise. But that aside, it is a very, very, very well run, effective organization, political organization, and that that's a part of its success overall, or its resilience or its ability to replicate in Lebanon and to stay relevant. And then going back to what you said at the start, the miracle of Lebanon, it's very normative to sort of say what works or what doesn't. I can certainly point to other power sharing arrangements, for example, in Burundi, that are upheld by paramilitary style organizations of the youth movement who are intimidating local inhabitants to vote for the major party. There are certain groups that have that element of armed wing that can promote them. Does it work normatively? Does it bode well for the future governance of the country? We can say probably no. Does it stumble along, being able to engage? And the wonderful thing about Lebanon is that, we always find a compromise for everything. It's okay, right, so there's a compromising nature to the ability. Okay, your resistance, fair enough, just don't use it internally. Okay, you used it internally that once. Okay, well, maybe more. Okay, well, let's just continue.
I'm going to interrupt you here because I remember once interacting with an academic, not a Pracademic, an academic, and he was giving me the full title, consociational confessional construct, or there was some very elaborate term to explain the Lebanese state. I just said compromise, at times with a caveat.
Exactly. And it's my consociation is the
consociation. Thank you. That's what it is. Yes, consociation.
I'm interviewing people during my PhD. They would go, "What? We just call it confessionalism, or the system." Taef for in Northern Ireland, they call it power sharing in our accent. So, essentially, in its original conception, academically, it was a system that was about elites compromising.
Yes.
And making deals. And what we have is certainly an elite group that has the balance of power for the reasons that we have outlined in this wonderful chat. And that doesn't make, so even in the original conception of power sharing, you have one particular political actor that always holds a trump card over everyone else. I don't mean to say that as a pun for Donald Trump.
No, but I asked the other comparisons, and you're right to point out that this is all normative. Just states that have prospered with that kind of entity that's active. To me, the FARC example in Colombia seems to be it's not directly the same, different issues altogether, but there is a very large sub-state group with arms that the state bends towards. At times fought, the Lebanese example that does not exist, but at times fought. And even in Colombia, they seem to be finding a way to kind of disarm over time that group. So even in Colombia, you have that inevitable conclusion that you can the monopoly of violence seems to be standard across the board. Burundi, I don't know that example. I'm glad you pointed it out. Is it akin to the Hezbollah's weight in Lebanon? Is that kind of?
I mean, there in Burundi, you certainly have like a monopoly of violence that is headed in the current major political party, and that's a worry for everyone. But I mean, again, I go back to, does it work? Probably not in the way that academics or practitioners or people who believe in democracy want it to work. I definitely think that the Colombia example is really good, probably a better example than the Burundi one, but about a slow disarmament or also reintegration into state structures. What we see DDR campaigns is that idea of demilitarizing and demobilizing those and bringing them into the state structure or integrating them into state structures. And of course, rather than doing that, the fact is Lebanon is effectively doesn't just work in one sub-state actor. Everyone holds their monopolies. They don't hold the monopoly as effectively as Hezbollah, but they have their areas, their territorial areas of influence, and they administer to their clients. They administer to their particular groups in their areas, and they work as mini states because the state of Lebanon has been so patently stripped of all of its relevance.
Right.
So and we saw that in the 50s, Fouad Shahab, whenever he tried to create effectively a state in Lebanon, which is education system, social, the entities, your pension, all these different sort of ideas of what social welfare and state means. And we saw, and who was the biggest pushback against that was the Zion, because we were started to undermine their sub-state influence. And whenever you work on an overall system that, and again tying it into recent events in Lebanon, that really put the emphasis on those certain political actors and empowers them, you're an organization like Hezbollah that does it very effectively and is working within the rules of the Lebanese game. It's as quintessentially working as a Lebanese organization under those rules, and it's profiting more because it's better funded, it's well organized, it's well armed, and it's it's well organized.
And it is hell-bent on preserving the post-Taef order. That even when you have people on the streets trying to get rid of what you mentioned earlier, this layers and layers of whatever the words are, crony capitalism, nepotism, mismanagement, thuggery, all of the above. The old, unfortunate power-sharing ways that we got used to in Lebanon, that they are able to, at least for the moment, push a bit against that. But Hezbollah, even when they push against that group's corruption, but let alone its weapons, it doesn't seem to be something that you can have changing with domestic considerations, that there has to be a geopolitical calculation. And I guess that goes back to just the Northern Ireland story evolved to a point where there was enough international attention to end that conflict. And in a way, that's enough for Northern Ireland is really just the Americans kind of just going in and saying, we're going to help end this now. In the Lebanese context, it just doesn't happen. It's not there.
And just as a quick point is that, yeah, you're right, that there is an effective, like mediation requires an impartial actor. But early on, like we had the PUL, the Protestant, loyalist, unionist community reject American influence because they perceive the Americans as being biased towards the Catholics. Because you have a population and you're Clinton's going for re-election. This is a game that we've seen before. We know what you're doing. You gave Jerry Adams a visa. So there's always that element in solving these local domestic disputes. But what we can sure as hell say is that those, that Iran is, no one's going to dispute Iran and Syria have a vested interest in maintaining Hezbollah.
Yes.
We're not going to say that, like, similarly, that other regional actors don't have a vested interest in maintaining their clients in Lebanon, and unable to decouple that, and which means that they continue replicating their power on the ground in Lebanon as mini sub-state actors, acting as the state, as the person who gets your kid who goes to the decommissioning and gets your degree or gets your driving license and gets everything.
Yes.
We can't decouple, like, the political economy and capture of the state from these sub-state actors.
So really, and we can sort of end it, and you'll tell me if I got this right or wrong. This is the most important point in the whole conversation. 1979, Bono says Sunday, Bloody Sunday, internationalizes that conflict. 20-some years later, 30 years later, there's this unknown song in one of the backtracks of an album that no one listened to called Cedars of Lebanon. And it kind of just went under the radar. No one cared.
I thought we were going in a place that we were going to, like, accept Bono's, like, relevance as someone who ended the Northern Ireland conflict, and that's something that we can't accept, because Bono, as great as a band as U2 are or were, Bono's,
I like that. We don't even know at this point, are or were.
Well, you say there's a joke here that says, "What's the difference between Bono and God?" God doesn't go around thinking he's Bono. So what Lebanon needed was a really good, like, song. Okay, I can get behind that. I mean, we're not short of talent. Get Beirut to sing something, and then we're good. I will end on, like, one point. I did promise you a story, and I can't name a name, but let's just say, like, a particular very prominent hereditary mountain leader.
Okay, that's not obvious at all. Go ahead. Yes.
Northern Ireland. And I had this story firsthand from people who were beside said leader at the time, who, and just to scale the difference between the two places, he met with various people who were part of the decommissioning, and then he asked the very pertinent question. It was like, well, how much did you decommission? And then, they named, okay, like 1,000 rifles, blah, 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 2 tons of Semtex. What they found, some parts of the decommissioning were like World War II guns, and like really some old stuff. Yeah. So this particular mountain leader, hereditary mountain leader who remains nameless, said, yeah, whenever I decommissioned, I got rid of a tank division, 50 caliber heavy artillery, several units of X amount of, like, explosive teams, and everyone's like, oh, okay. We realize this scale is completely different. But while the scale may be different, a lot of the conceptual similarities are remained, and I think that we did a good job in drawing them together.
But you're ending on a very important point, which is a unnamed mountain leader, hereditary, etc., is disarmed. And geopolitics is part of that story, that he's disarmed. Maybe he doesn't want to be disarmed, but he's disarmed. In the 1990s, he's not known as a militiaman. He's known as just exactly what you said, an old hereditary mountain leader. Maybe not the shiniest, maybe not the most well-intentioned, who knows? But that he's just one of the crowd now. He's not special. That's I think, an important note, that he can be disarmed. One group cannot. And that seems to be the inevitable conclusion, that there is sort of an anomaly at the Lebanese story. Otherwise, the civil war should have ended without just being a pause per se.
I agree, and I think it's a really important point. I'm glad you brought it up, and it comes back to that balance of power. While there are still states in the region that support, I mean, that particular group, very small ethnic group, has precarious position in the country, in the region generally, and doesn't have the compliance or patron of several, like, powers in the area. Exactly. So this is the key dilemma.
You were very kind with your time, Drew. We've said almost everything. I'm sure there's other things we could have squeezed in, but I think we have a solid conversation. And the next time we speak, it'll either be a sequel to this conversation, or, if you don't mind me sharing it, when your book is out, because the book kind of touches on this subject too. It's not only on Lebanon and Northern Ireland, of course, but the wider conflict resolution story that you're part of. And I hope we get to meet in person soon enough.
Yes.
I spent 4 years in the UK, and I lived in Edinburgh for 4 years, and I think
okay, literally the best place to live in the UK.
That's what everyone in the UK says, and then most people I meet in the UK have never been. They're like, oh, it's lovely up there. Have you been? No, never went.
Yeah. Pack a heavy for the winter, especially if you're Lebanese, but at the same time...
exactly. But I wish I had it here. I usually have this Edinburgh... Oh, here it is. I have my little coffee coaster of Edinburgh with me. There's some Edinburgh pictures on the wall. I'll just end it with saying something I thought was perfect. And it's not Northern Ireland, of course. It's Scotland. I was there... I arrived, I think, the week of the referendum. Mm-hmm. And, of course, it's a very close vote. Inevitably, Scotland stays in the UK. And I was walking in Newtown, just trying to get to Old Town. There's no Hamra Ashrafiyya. There's Newtown, Old Town. It's a lot easier. This is the new part.
On the street. And
and the new town is actually quite old, and old is really old, right? And BBC, sort of a team of journalists and microphone and camera, they kind of come up towards me. And they're like, what do you think about the referendum? It's an underwhelming moment. It's very calm, very peaceful, and very quiet.
So did they ask you because they felt that you looked like Scottish with,
They assumed, and to be fair, that's the only place on planet Earth I've ever been where I felt at home. I'm like, these are my people. I probably have some genes from Scotland. Yeah. But I told them, and I think the reason they kept talking to me is because what I was saying, I think they didn't expect. It's like, I just flew from Lebanon, and I mean, this is not a referendum. Where's the gunshots? Where are the fireworks? Where are the armed groups you need? If the vote didn't work, we make it work. And she's like talking. She's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, no. This is too peaceful. It's too peaceful. Try again.
Yeah. Exactly. Let's review what is really going to happen now.
And there, it shows just how. I mean, there are certain conflicts that are there. They're visible still. And you mentioned it at the beginning. There are some that conflict resolution doesn't mean 100% in any context. But definitely there are different ways of handling problems. And it seems that, the UK seems to be a shining star in that sense.
Right. It was, for sure. And then, Brexit has reopened.
Sure.
Like, for example, the UK, the agreement between the Union itself, between Scotland and England, over 300-year-old document of, a pretty good example of resolving conflict, then flung open off the back of a wave of populism, right populism, and rejecting globalization. And we saw how quickly that, when I was a kid, the idea of Scottish independence and nationalism was it was silly, because it was like, well, why would you want it? This is the best of all worlds. We get the economic benefits, the freedom of movement benefits. No one is denying your Scottish
and the autonomy. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
Right. So your own government, devolved government. So then bringing this idea back, this is a part of an overall regional geopolitical balance of a growth of a particular populist movement that we've seen globally.
Right.
So and we can see how quickly that can torpedo the what was once a solid idea of a Scottish remaining a part of the Union, which is now constantly...
It's open question. You're right, absolutely. On that note, thank you, Drew. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Awesome.
Thanks for listening, and a friendly reminder to help support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.